This video is on the Frass meteorite and the evidence of its Martian origin. To start the story properly, I think I should go back to my childhood. When I was a very young child, my mother set me down one day and she said, "Son, you're a Christian, and here's what Christians do. They read the Bible every night and they pray for those things that are important and those things they want." Well, as a child, I had no clue what was important, but I did know what I wanted. Ever since I'd heard the first words of suns and stars and planets, and that the stars were just like our own sun, but they were very far away, I always wanted a piece of a sun, or I wanted to go there. But as a small child, I couldn't figure out how to accomplish that. So every night of my life, from the time I was in probably the first grade all the way to high school, I prayed every night that God would send me a piece of space. And so one day I was working on my great aunt's ranch, and this is a picture of it right here. We were feeding the cattle in the winter of 70-71, and on the ranch, what you do is make the same rounds every day and try to arrive at every pasture about the same time. That way, the cattle kind of know when you're coming, and they come in to be fed. So we started out at the farmhouse over here, the ranch house. We'd gone through the meadow, over into the red mill, up into the southeast pasture, over into the middle pasture. You can see the mill here. And this pasture back here is called the Sidna. I don't know why. The one right here in front of it is called the North Meadow. So as we exited this pasture, we drove this way, we came through a gate right here. And the very second that we turned north, this being north in this direction, we saw this meteorite, which is right about here somewhere, about a quarter, maybe between a quarter and a half a mile from where we were. Both my aunt and I saw it instantly. She exclaimed, "What's that on my ranch?" And I said, "Well, if it's a rock that fell from space, that makes it a meteorite." So we picked it up that day, and I kept it with me all these years ever since. Now I'd like to get into the scientific evidence of the Martian origin of the Frass meteorite. And I named it the Frass meteorite because my great aunt's name was Frass, and it was called the Frass Ranch where it landed. It's kind of ironic, but Frass is also the name of insect poop, and it appears that Mars has a lot of insects on it, so maybe it's an appropriate name. Who knows? The first thing I would like to discuss is the fusion crust, the glass ingots, and the structure of the meteorite. Here we have evidence of the fusion crust. My meteorite is different than most. Most meteorites are nickel iron or heavy stone, and many of them fall essentially straight down, meaning they burn up or get very, very hot. My meteorite appears to be the newly formed material from Mars, or volcanic material that occurred on Mars. And it has a structure that makes it very hard for it to melt very much. It's made much like a space shuttle heat tile, in that it has very thin walls that are very high in silicon and just great number of vesicles inside of it. So I've examined the entire meteorite, and it never seemed to melt more than about a quarter of an inch deep anywhere. Also, the meteorite had a single orientation as it came through our atmosphere, and it had a very shallow flight. And so I think it essentially flew all the way down to the ground. The shape of it is much like the lifting bodies that NASA tested in the early 60s. They found that certain shapes had a lifting capability, and that they could use that in their landers. So the meteorite shows the same evidence. It's far more melted on the bottom than it is on the top, and you can actually see the orientation that it came through the atmosphere in, being far more melted on one side than on the other side. And then further evidence of that is the glass ingots that I found, especially on the bottom of it, places where it got very hot. The material that was inside the meteorite, which looked like this before it melted, just sandy material, in the vesicle, got so hot that it melted and made a little ingot of glass. The glass was shaped exactly like the vesicle on the bottom and was flat on top and contained unmelted particles in it that you can see that it was made from the same material inside the meteorite. So this shows to me that the meteorite had cooled by the time it reached the lower atmosphere. This glass had cooled, and these ingots are evidence of it being a meteorite and coming through the atmosphere, as well as the fusion crust. And again, the structure of it is what I think allows that: high silicon, thin walls, and many, many vesicles. The next thing I'd like to discuss is the composition, the core sample, the elemental oxides, and the linear chemistry. When I tried to get scientists to look at this for a long time, and they rejected me for any number of reasons, so I decided to do my own testing. The rock is so delicate that I thought about it for a long time. How could I get samples out of the middle of it? And what I ended up doing was taking core samples, and I did that by taking a piece of copper pipe, and everybody that's worked with copper knows how delicate it is, and I just hammered it into the meteorite about 3 inches. Here's the core samples I got. There's some parts that broke off. Right here you can see 3 little, what I call clods of dirt that was in some of the vesicles that fell out. Here's all the sand that fell out. Here's more sand that fell out. And so the rock is so delicate that you can actually just drive a piece of copper into it. I believe the whole rock is so delicate that if I was to take it and put it over my head and throw it hard against a concrete sidewalk, that it would break into 1,000,000 pieces. So at that point, I sent off a number of samples and to get the elemental oxides. During this time, I was reading, watching, this was during the Pathfinder, and so I studied every article that came out about it. I watched everything they were doing, and so I ran essentially the same test that they were running, which is elemental oxides. I did a total of 5 tests. One was what I call the gray rock, and it's here and here. One was what I call the red rock, it's here and here. One was a mixture of the two, and then I did 2 samples that were called sand. In each of these graphs, the sand plots the furthest, meaning that it's been worked the longest. The sand in each one of these is made, I separated it just using a mechanical situation. So I did one separation and got very small particles, and then a second separation and got the very finest of particles. Now, all these plots are these are plots from Pathfinder. The orange plots are plots from local volcanoes. I was told that if I didn't prove that the meteorite didn't come from Earth, that no one would study it. So a geologist I'd met gave me a study of all the volcanoes that were within 500 miles or so of my meteorite, of where it landed. And so what I did was plot all of these out. Then I plotted my rock, and I plotted the Martian rocks. And I did it for quite a number of different elements, and we'll kind of go through a few of them. But in the end, even though lots of times my material does go through earthly material, which I think is appropriate, many of the times it does plot far out here with the Martian rocks. And the statement about Alman Treatment over here, I'd just like to read this. He said, on that graph, the analysis of Frass sand do plot in the area of Mars rocks, but one cannot conclude that the sand is from Mars. The Mars and Earth areas of this graph are not applicable to sand. Only basalt lava rocks are their close equivalents. Well, what I tried to show him is that the sand of Mars is basalt rocks. It is tiny, the one labeled sand 2 is made up of tiny little pieces of basalt rock that have broken off. And the smaller ones are almost all silicon. I think the reason for this, on Earth, it's taught in geology class that if material sits in a volcano or sits in a hot spring and works for a while, that the higher elements leave it and it ends up just being the lighter elements, usually silicon. And that's how we get high silicon content. We've also found that on Mars. And so what the linear, and every single graph, when I plot mine, it plots linear. And what it's exactly showing is what's taught on Earth is that when these things happen, when the material sits in a volcano long enough, the heavy elements leave it and it just has the light elements. So that would be sand 1 and sand 2. These compare very favorably with the measurements on Mars. So for this man to say that he cannot accept these because they're not basalt is just totally false, because they are basalts. They are clearly basalts, and the linear nature here shows that everything in my meteorite, every single particle from the oldest to the youngest, all came from the same source material. On Earth, they teach this, but you never see it because things are intermixed all the time. On Earth, you have volcanoes and things are mixed and the whole Earth is moving and the continents are drifting. But on Mars, none of that happened. The systems have remained isolated. Later, I'll show you a report from scientists that show that the systems on Mars are isolated. And this linear chemistry is the clearest evidence of the Martian origin of my meteorite. And I would like to just now scan across these over to the other side. Okay, the next thing I would like to discuss is the ages. Again, I couldn't get any scientists to do anything, so I paid for these tests myself. These potassium argon dating tests were $800 a piece at the time. Money I didn't have, but money I spent to try to find out about the meteorite. What I finally learned, this one is 13, this one is 34, and this is 49 million years ago. What I finally learned was that the gray material right here is 13 million years old, represents most of the meteorite, and it's never been in the presence of water. It hasn't been oxidized. The red material is 49 million years old. It has been oxidized. It has been in the presence of liquid water on the surface of Mars, and that's why it changed red. Last weekend, I watched a children's program on Mars, and they said the latest rover, with its drill through the red material into the gray material below it. I don't know what I have to do to prove that this came from Mars. So the next thing I'd like to discuss is the butterscotch sand and the 36 million year boundary layer. When the Pathfinder was on Mars, after a few months, they announced that Mars was no longer the red planet, it was a butterscotch-colored planet, because the sands of Mars are butterscotch-colored. So what we have here is some lava that flowed apparently from a side vent of an isolated Martian volcano at 49 million years ago. During the 36 million years intervening, this much sand accumulated. And then at 13 million years ago, this lava flowed probably at the same exact location and probably the same side venting of an ancient volcano. Along with this, though, there was probably water because of all the creatures I find and because all the particles in the thing are covered with sand. So this is further evidence. This rock could not have sat on the Earth for all of this time and only accumulated that much. This looks like what happens on Mars in 36 billion years, not what happens on Earth. The next thing I'd like to discuss is the water experiments. My contention is that this portion of the meteorite, the vast majority, has not been wet. So what I did was a number of experiments. Here was one of them where I took one of these little particles that fell out of the inside of the meteorite, and I put a drop of water on it, and that's when I realized that there was a rock inside of it, and that's when I realized there had to be more than one age. Since this rock was inside the other rock, this one had to be older. So this is what it looked like before I put the water on it. This is what it looked like afterwards. The next thing I did was I found this little red rock that had fallen out, and it looked different than everything, and I put 4 drops of water on it, and to my surprise, it melted, and it ran off. You can see this is all part of it. It just melted and ran and stuck to my Petri dish, and it's been stuck there ever since. It also has given rise to a colony of what I call the glassy Martian rock fungus, or glassies for short, that I've been growing in test tubes for decades now, and is apparently the creature that causes Morgellons disease on Earth. So I have this in a test tube. I've had it in there for 20 or 30 years. I've put it in the freezer for 6 months. It still just grows. It hasn't had any light in years, and it still grows. I have pictures of the growth over the years to show how much it's grown. So, and I did one further experiment where I just put a little bit of water on the outside of the meteorite on some of the gray material, and a little piece fell off. And my contention is that that gray material has never been wet, and that it scooped up these different materials, and by putting water on it, I replaced some bonds that were lost, and the piece just falls off. It was only held there by the bonds of the lack of water. And so I think the evidence is strong that the meteorite itself has never been wet, and if it had been on Earth for any period of time, it would have been completely destroyed. The next thing I'd like to discuss is the magnetic dust, and I'll also show you an article that from the Viking. There was magnets on the Viking. The dust on Mars is magnetic. Surprisingly, part of it may be titanium oxide magnetism. Most magnetism comes from iron, but there is a form of titanium oxide that has magnetic properties. So the dust of Mars, this is a magnet. This is the dust from my meteorite. It is magnetic, and the meteorite itself is magnetic slightly. This goes along with the evidence, too, that Mars once had a central core, which has now evolved into several maybe smaller cores. Each one of them has their own magnetism around it. So my meteorite also is magnetic. The way I determined that was put the meteorite on a chair and then tied a magnet to a string and then held it close to the meteorite, and the magnet will swing. So it is slightly magnetic. The next thing I would like to discuss is the life. I have a few samples of it. I've told you about the Morgellons creatures, or glacies as I call them, but here's another creature that I found in it. It appears to me to be a radial symmetry type of ocean creature. It has little tentacles that come around and apparently a mouth right at the top of it here, and some little tentacles. I've named it Rose, though, because it looks like a rose somewhat from the top too. And then next thing is a black worm. This is I still have everything in it, but the flying insect I'll show you in a minute. Every one of these are covered completely with the sand of Mars. I don't know of any way that I could fake any of this. Here's a very important, this is the only thing I do not have, and this is a blind flying insect. Under the microscope, you can see a lot more than any picture that you can ever take. And I examined the face of this thing for days and days. I could find no facial features whatsoever. Had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, but it had these two antennae. And the evidence is when Mars did have an atmosphere, that it might have been very dense, and so not much light got to the surface, so that would explain why I found no eyes on anything. Nothing, none of the insect bodies. And so there's also a number of little tree parts that are in the meteorite. And this is the very first thing I saw, the very first time I took a sample and looked at the sand. It's a part of a little tree here, and then it has a glacis on it, and several of them attached to it. Ever since that I've tried to get this meteorite accepted, I've gone to virtually every meteoritic person in the world, and they have all rejected me, and I don't understand why. It's like they're acting that I'm trying to put something over on them, but all I've ever asked to do is for them to test it. If I was trying to put something over on them, I would be asking them not to test it. And to my knowledge, no scientist has ever done a single test on this meteorite, yet dozens of them have proclaimed that it couldn't come from Mars, apparently without a single test. And that includes the lab here at Los Alamos. I have a whole series of papers and emails of when they were going to examine the meteorite. They said that they would be glad to examine it if I would let them drill a hole all the way through it. So I let them drill a hole all the way through it, and then they said, well, they weren't going to study it because they could tell that it wasn't a meteorite because it wasn't shocked enough to be ejected from Mars. So I showed them a paper that showed that none of the Martian meteorites showed shocking from their ejection, and they didn't care about the evidence. They just decided that their opinion it wasn't a meteorite, so they didn't study it. And now I'd like to quickly go over a series of, when I first did this, this is my study manual from 2000 and 2001. This ends at 2001, but there's a whole number. We'll see that there's water evidence all the way back there. And I find it striking that recently NASA made an announcement that they'd found liquid water on the surface of Mars right before they put out the Mars movie. Now that was just, to me, it was a totally fake announcement. If you looked at the video they were showing, it was from 2011. We've known of water on Mars all the way back to 2000. In my opinion, NASA just made that announcement to promote the movie, and which is really a shame that that's where science has come to. So I need my glasses on this to read all these. But this one shows that Mars had a small core at one time, just as I said. Weathering process, exactly as I've described, with the butterscotch-colored sand and those kind of things. Magnetic phase tells about the magnetism of Mars, exactly what I've described here. The oxidation of the surface material, red when it's oxidized, gray when it's not. Martian systems are isolated. This is the very paper that says that the systems are isolated on Mars, and that you expect the chemistry to show that. Liquid water and life on Mars. This goes, well, this is one of the most important. This is Gilbert Levin. This is the guy that designed the experiment on the Viking lander. There was 3 or 4 experiments to determine life on that. All but one was positive for life. And so you should just say, well, there's life on Mars, but no, our world says no, there's no life. So what this guy has done is taken the one experiment that didn't show exactly that there was life, and he's studied it forever, and he's found several things. He's found there's no other explanation of all the scientific things given for what he's observed, and he found circadian rhythms in his data after re-examining them. So clearly, he found life. He spent his whole life working on this, trying to get this accepted, that there's water and life on Mars. But we're pretty stupid as a species, apparently. Here is, I think this is so interesting. Here's the rocks of Mars. If you look at my meteorite, it just fits in here perfectly. You can... This is exactly what my meteorite looks like. It's just been rounded a little bit more, and you see it's the same color, the gray color. You have some of the red color. This is a true color photograph of Mars, and everything is the exact same color as my meteorite. Martian volcanoes may have driven key water process and made the atmosphere. We think that happens on every planet, that the volcanoes is what brings up water and brings up the atmosphere. But that's happened on Mars, and its systems have been isolated, unlike on Earth. Ice below the surface of Mars. Way back here, they found enough water on Mars to cover the planet ankle deep. Yet, if you listen to the news, they're still wondering if there's actually water on Mars, and they're showing that this ice was in the last 10 million years. Now, I've said that there was water on Mars on the surface for the last 50 million years, so here's further evidence that I'm correct on that. This one just shows the different wet-dry cycles. My meteorite seems to show that Mars has been through a whole number of wet-dry cycles, and apparently the life has learned to live through these dry cycles. There are still things in my meteorite that look like they're alive, look like they're little eggs, little Martians waiting to hatch. A long time ago, I got an idea, maybe we should go to Mars and bring back some of the old ocean material and put it in aquariums so people could have little Martian things swimming around in their earthly aquariums. That was before I discovered Glasses, or the Morgellons disease. Martian ice, signs of water, 2001. Evidence of icy region in recent climate change. There's evidence that Mars climate changed about 100,000 years ago. So it could have been wet up until that point. And maybe the windy and dry situation we see now has evolved since that time. Scientists say Mars Viking mission found life. I don't know what it takes for humanity to accept it, but to me the evidence is overwhelming. There's life on Mars. More evidence of magnetism. This is a magnetic plate on the Pathfinder. Again, it showed that the dust is magnetic. It's magnetic in the Frass meteorite. This has been a real interesting thing that I followed around this time, is that NASA, for some reason, put out all their photographs with the tinted to the red. Other reputable labs would reprocess them and get the true colors. And Mars, and NASA would always say, well, we have trouble processing the colors because you can't exactly tell. Well, that's just a bunch of bull. There was a color chart on the lander itself that they can take pictures of. And I can just show you on my website, I had hundreds of occasions where NASA had put out pictures that were tinted to the red when the real picture showed that Mars looks a lot like Earth. Here's a true color picture. The sky is blue on Mars. There's how big the sun is from Mars. It's very small. More pictures, and we see also that same color as my meteorite. Here's, I still have this creature. This is apparently a Martian spider. On Earth, all spiders have a fused head and thorax. My spider has a movable head on it. And again, no eyes, or I couldn't find any differentiation on the head at all. But it's definitely looks like a spider, and I've still got it, and there should be DNA that we can check all of this if somebody really cares about finding the truth. And then here's a little one that I played a trick where I just painted my meteorite in on the Martian surface here. So that's not real, but you can see how well it fits. And then here's the evidence from the lab of all the different things that went on. I won't go into that. And so that is the evidence of the Martian origin of the Frass meteorite. Thank you.